TAC members and anybody who's watching online, as permitted by the governor's state of emergency order, our TAC members will be participating today virtually. All members will vote by roll call and will be recognized by Kelly when we have a need for a vote. Reminder, please, on our ethics: if you, your extended family, or any business in which you have an interest stands to gain financially from any vote that you make today, you do need to identify yourself and abstain from voting. Do we have any members that have a potential conflict of interest? Very good, thank you. Also, thank you, members. I think almost everybody has completed their ethics training. I think we have just one individual that hasn't, and Guido's visiting this afternoon to take care of that one. But I believe everybody else is locked in, and I thank you for taking time to do that. Kelly, if you go ahead and do our roll call.
Yes, sir. Mayor Joynes?
Present.
Mr. Robert Clark?
Here.
Ms. Adams?
Present.
Mr. Cross?
Here.
Mr. Rocket?
Here.
Mr. Combest?
Here.
Mr. Apple? Mr. Bill Apple? Maybe not.
I'm here. Bill Apple is here.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Lane?
Here.
Mayor Mike Horn?
Here.
Mr. Byram?
Here.
Mr. Marion?
Here.
Mr. Hutchins?
Here.
Mr. Shores?
Here.
Mr. Perkins?
Here.
Mr. Willie Clark?
Here.
Is there anybody else that has logged in?
Elimination is present.
Mr. Elamine?
Yes, present.
That concludes it, sir.
Very good. Thank you, Kelly. Byron, are you keeping track if anybody's called in that wishes to speak during our public comment period, or is Kelly doing that?
I don't see anyone here for public comment.
Okay, very good. Anybody should happen to join us, enjoy the meeting. Members, you've had a chance to review our March minutes. If there are no changes or additions, I'd accept a motion to approve.
So moved, Mr. Chairman. Bill Apple.
Second, Denise Adams.
Mr. Apple makes the motion, Ms. Adams makes the second. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Can we do that, or do we have to do the roll call, don't we, Kelly?
We have to do the roll call, sir.
Okay, well,
Apologies.
let's dive in and do that. I wish we could do just if there's anybody objecting that we could then register it that way, but I guess we can't do it that way.
Unfortunately.
From a park provision, we can do that. So why wouldn't the MPO not be able to do that?
Because we follow the city's attorney's direction. And so because it's City of Winston-Salem, the lead planning agency, we follow the city attorney's lead on that.
Okay, the city attorney is different from our attorney. Okay, I got it. Go ahead. I'll leave it alone.
Rules for our members, Mr. Perkins, but legally, that is.
Okay. All right.
Okay,
All right, I will start. Mayor Joynes?
Yes.
Mr. Clark?
Yes.
Ms. Adams?
Yes.
Mr. Elamine?
Yes.
Mr. Cross?
Yes.
Mr. Rocket?
Yes.
Mr. Combest?
Aye.
Mr. Apple?
Yes.
Mr. Lane?
Yes.
Mr. Mike Horn?
Yes.
Mr. Byram?
Yes.
Mr. Marion?
Yes.
Mr. Hutchins?
Yes.
Mr. Shores?
Yes.
Mr. Perkins?
Yes.
Mr. Clark? Mr. Willie Clark?
Yes.
And that concludes it.
Very good. I heard a couple of beeps. Did anybody just join us who wasn't here for the beginning of the meeting? All righty. Matthew Burzik, you have the next item for our consideration. You have the floor.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And good afternoon, TAC members. The item before you, number 3, is a review of the Surface Transportation Block Grant Direct Attributable and Transportation Alternatives Direct Attributable funding for recommended projects through our 2022 call for projects. So the Winston-Salem Urban Area MPO has the authority to program available Surface Transportation Block Grant Direct Attributable and Transportation Alternatives Direct Attributable funds for transportation planning, bicycle greenway, sidewalk, street and highway, transit, and other projects in the urban area. On January 4th of this year, MPO staff announced a call for projects to begin the process of programming approximately $17 million in STPG-DA and TAP-DA funds. In February of this year, MPO communities submitted 11 sidewalk projects, 3 greenway projects, 2 intersection projects, 1 small roadway project, and 1 transit project for funding consideration through the call for projects. The total amount of federal funds requested was approximately $28 million. The projects were reviewed and evaluated by a committee that included the MPO's Planning Development Coordinator and Bicycle and Pedestrian Coordinator, the City of Winston-Salem engineering staff, Town of Walkertown staff, NCDOT's Division 9 proposals engineer and the project development engineer, and a member of the public. The review committee agreed on a recommendation to fund 11 projects across 5 agencies and organizations. The review committee also agreed to set aside the funds originally reserved for Davidson County Transit as a planning fund reserve since Davidson County Transit declined those funds. One thing to note on the resolution, we will update that resolution to specifically mention those DCT funds being moved to a planning reserve. We don't specifically mention that in the resolution, so we'll make sure to update that. The attached tables contain the lists of ranked projects and the proposed funding strategy. The next step will be for the TAC here to approve those funding recommendations and then update the MTIP accordingly. I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone may have.
Members, any questions for Matthew? We have a resolution in front of us for approval with the suggested change that or addition that Matthew just mentioned.
I move approval of item 3.
Second. Adams.
As Adams makes the motion, Mr. Joynes makes the second. Any discussion? Kelly, call the roll, please.
Yes, sir. Mayor Joynes,
Yes.
Mr. Clark,
Yes.
Ms. Adams,
Yes.
Mr. Elamine,
Yes.
Mr. Cross,
Yes.
Mr. Rocket,
Yes.
Mr. Combest,
Aye.
Mr. Apple,
Aye.
Mr. Lane,
Yes.
Mr. Horn,
Yes.
Mr. Byram,
Yes.
Mr. Marion,
Yes.
Mr. Hutchins,
Yes.
Mr. Shores,
Yes.
Mr. Perkins,
Abstain.
and Mr. Willie Clark.
Yes.
Mr. Perkins, just clarification, you're abstaining from this, not for.
I am because I'll be reviewing this again at the Board of Transportation. Yes.
Very good. Thank you. Kelly, it sounded unanimous to me with 1 abstention. Thank you, members.
That is correct.
Matthew, you have item number 4, please.
All right. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Item number 4 is an action request, consideration of a request to support the North Carolina Clean Energy Center's effort to create a 4th Clean Cities Coalition in North Carolina to represent the Winston-Salem urban area and other underrepresented regions of the state. So the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center has a mission to advance a sustainable energy economy by educating, demonstrating, and providing support for clean energy technologies, practices, and policies. The NCC-ETC currently collaborates with the 3 Clean Cities coalitions in the state, which cover the Charlotte, Raleigh-Durham, and Asheville metropolitan areas. Those Clean Cities coalitions were originally created by the U.S. Department of Energy to help reduce reliance on petroleum products and improve air quality. Currently, though, only 44% of the state's population is covered by those 3 existing coalitions. The 4th Clean Cities Coalition would cover an additional 45% of the state's population. And NCC-ETC is seeking partners to help form that coalition. The NCC-ETC has asked that the Winston-Salem Urban Area MPO support the formation of this new Clean Cities Coalition to broaden the opportunities for clean fleets, alternative fuels, and sustainable transportation across the state. There's no financial commitment required of our MPO, and in return for our support, member jurisdictions will have access to resources providing guidance on methods to improve the efficiency and sustainability of fleet vehicles. Again, I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody may have.
Any questions for Matthew? Members, we have a resolution in front of us for adoption.
Move to approve, Elimination.
Second, Clark, Robert.
Mr. Ali makes the motion. Mr. Clark makes the second. Any further discussion? Okay, Kelly.
Yes, sir. Mayor Joines,
Yes.
Mr. Clark voted yes. Ms. Adams,
yes,
Mr. Ellerman voted yes. Mr. Cross,
Yes.
Mr. Rocket,
Yes.
Mr. Combest,
Aye.
Mr. Apple,
Aye.
Mr. Lane,
Yes.
Mr. Horn,
Yes.
Mr. Byron,
Yes.
Mr. Marion,
Yes.
Mr. Hutchins,
Yes.
Mr. Shores,
Yes.
Mr. Perkins,
Yes.
and Mr. Willie Clark.
Yes.
Very good, members. That's unanimous. Thank you very much. Moving into our information items that we will have action on in the future. Byron, I believe you have some NTIP amendments.
Sorry about that. Good afternoon, everyone, members of the board. The 2020 to 2029 Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Program is a listing of all the projects programmed for the Winston-Salem urban area. This document is a subset of the 2045 Metropolitan Transportation Plan and reflects projects programming included in the state's Transportation Improvement Program. NCDOT regularly updates the STIP to include new projects and modify existing ones. This could be done for reasons such as funding, municipal requests, or schedule changes. Statewide projects are projects which are located in our planning area. As their schedules, funding, and programming is modified, these changes are reflected in our MTIP. Including your materials are project modifications, additions, and deletions, including the addition of funding for various statewide programming at the request of IMD. Depot Street in Walkertown sidewalk construction is delayed to allow for additional planning and design. Louisville Vienna Road and Louisville intersection conversion to a single lane roundabout has also been delayed for additional time for planning and design. These amendments were made available for public review for 30 days between April 11th, 2022 and May 12th, 2022 for public participation policy. No comments were received during that time, and this is an information item. It will come back to you for action at the next meeting. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Byron? Righty, thank you, Byron. Matt 2, you've got our number 6 item.
All right, thank you, Chairman Horn. Good afternoon, Chairman Horn, members of the committee, and members of City Council. Before I proceed, I just wanted to let everybody know that in the original delivery of the booklet, this was listed as a future MTIP modification, but because there is no change in the scope of work or the funding presented, there will be no modification to the MTIP. So this is a review of a request to reallocate funds for various fiscal years for both JARC programs and Section 5310 programs. Winston-Salem Urban Area Metropolitan Planning Organization staff is requesting the reallocation of funding for several awards across FTA Section 5310 and 5307 JARC. Subrecipients utilize 5310 and 5307 JARC funding to provide transportation access for the elderly and for individuals with disabilities, as well as for individuals requiring transportation to access jobs that they would otherwise not have access. Redistributing these funds to subrecipients we are certain will be able to use those funds to support community needs is one of the primary goals in transit management so that prior year funding grants can be closed. This will also allow for easier transition processes in future fiscal years. For fiscal year 19, Section 5310, the town of Kernersville will relinquish $45,000, which will be redistributed to 3 other subrecipients because they have outstanding reimbursement balances for previous years. For fiscal year 17 and 18 for Section 5310, Wake Forest Baptist Health Campus will relinquish $8,905 from both years because use of this funding was not pursued by the agency. And then for fiscal year 20 JARC, Horizons Residential Care, for fiscal year 2019 JARC, Community Transportation Program, and for fiscal year 2018 JARC, Winston-Salem Urban League will relinquish reimbursement awards to be redistributed to subrecipients in need of further funding. Horizons could not meet the intended uses of the funding, while the other 2 organizations were affected by COVID-19. The attached tables reference what subrecipients are having their funds redistributed, as well as which subrecipients will be receiving further funds for future reimbursement. This item is being brought to TAC as a group, so many reallocations can take place at one time and make way for further and more efficient reallocations as needed. I'm happy to take any questions on this matter.
Any questions for Matt? All righty, Matt, I believe you have our next item as well.
I did. Thank you, Chairman Horn. This is a review of the FTA program section 5307 funding allocations for Winston-Salem urban area for fiscal year 22, and this will have an amendment to the MTIP. Transit systems located in urban areas of more than 200,000 in population are eligible to use FTA sections 5307 funds for operating and capital assistance. FTA announced an allocation of $6,703,372 for fiscal year 2022. There currently are 3 transit agencies in the MPO eligible to receive 5307 funding based upon data reported to the National Transit Database. Those 3 are Davidson County Transportation, Piedmont Authority for Regional Transportation, and Winston-Salem Transit Authority. The number of eligible agencies may increase in future years. Additionally, activities traditionally eligible under the Job Access Reverse Commute, or JARC, program, which provides for job access for low-income individuals, continue to be an eligible activity for these funds. Based upon policies adopted by the Winston-Salem Urban Area MPO in 2017, funding will be distributed in accordance with the percentages developed by FTA as shown in the attached table. Based upon percentages in that table, it is then recommended that Davidson County Transportation receive $240,738, Piedmont Authority for Regional Transportation receives $746,080, and Winston-Salem Transit Authority receive $5,661,554. And finally, $55,000 will be used for traditional JARC programs. Each year, MPO staff shall coordinate a joint allocation meeting with eligible agencies to confirm that the funding identified can be used by the agency. Staff will use that information for recommendation to the TAC for final approval and distribution. MPO staff coordinated a meeting with the 3 transit agencies, and all 3 agreed with the funding recommendations provided. Staff will also recommend approval of an amendment to the MTIP. I'm happy to take any questions on this as well.
Any questions for Matt? All right, Matthew, you're in a role. You have the next
I'm out of sprint. And lastly, for me, this is a review of the Federal Transit Administration Section 5339 Bus and Bus Facilities Grant Program funding allocation for the Winston-Salem urban area for fiscal year 22 and plans to amend the MTIP. The Federal Transit Administration Section 5339 program is a formula-based grant program to replace, rehabilitate, and purchase buses and bus facilities. The program provides available federal resources to eligible direct recipients that operate fixed-route bus services or that allocate funding to fixed-route bus operators. This program originated through the Moving Ahead for Progress in the 21st Century Act, or MAP 21, which changed the program from discretionary to formula-based funding. Funding is now designated to states and designated recipients in urbanized areas of 200,000 people or more. The Winston-Salem urban area is eligible to receive $556,276 in fiscal year 22. WISTA is requesting to use the available funds to purchase 3 transit vans to replace aging fleet and the remaining funds for transit facility rehabilitation projects and capital maintenance. In accordance with federal standards, the program of projects outlines how WISTA will use these funds and the public participation requirements. The public participation period will be held for 30 days between May 23rd and June 23rd of 2022. The public hearing is scheduled to occur at the Transportation Advisory Committee meeting on July 18th, 2022, to provide maximum opportunities for public engagement and feedback. In order for WISTA to have these funds available, the following steps must be followed to include approval by the Transportation Advisory Committee, programming and amending of the MTIP and the 2020 to 2029 STIP, and submission to FTA. I'm happy to take any questions about this as well.
Very good. Matt, I'm proud of you for making it through all those. Almost sounded like you did it on one breath, but good job.
Yeah, it usually
Any questions
does.
for Matt?
Chairman Horn,
Yes, sir.
is that the correct date, July 18th?
And maybe the 21st. That might need to be corrected. Yeah, it should be the 21st. My
It'll be the
apologies.
21st.
Great eye there. Shows you're reading it. Great. No questions for Matthew. We'll now move on to, I guess, Matthew. We're going to bounce back to Matthew for our Urban Area Fiscal Year 2029 MTIP Adjusted Surface Block Grant.
All right. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Agenda item number 9 is an information item for future action. That action requested is a review of an amendment to the Winston-Salem Urban Area Fiscal Year 2020-2029 Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Program to adjust the Surface Transportation Block Grant direct attributable funding for projects in the Village of Clemens. So the Village of Clemens is requesting additional funding for 2 complementary sidewalk projects along Harper Road. The STIP numbers for those are EB 5960 and EB 6040. The scope of these projects includes the design and construction of sidewalk from Frank Morgan Elementary School to the Jerry Long YMCA and from Village Point Drive to east of the I-40 interchange, respectively. Both these projects were evaluated, recommended, and approved for DA funding in previous years by our MPO and the TAC. The Village of Clemens wishes to transfer all Surface Transportation Block Grant direct attributable funding from another project, U4741 PE, that's the Highway 158 sidewalk in Yadkin River Greenway, phase 1 of that project, to those above mentioned projects. The village would like to transfer $738,640 in federal funds to EB 6040 and $1,371,760 in federal funds to EB 5960. The proposed total federal funding amounts for EB 6040 and 5960 are $1,269,840 and $2,371,760 respectively. The village has provided the following reasons for canceling the U4741 PE project. There were periods of inactivity due to funding uncertainty. There were some significant increases in the cost of the project. There was also the potential for road expansion by NCDOT. The Village of Clemens will repay the already expended DA amount of $181,121 incurred under that U4741 PE project. The village is also prepared to contribute the $527,600 to the project to account for the 20% local match required for the federal funding portion. There are a couple memos attached detailing the request to transfer those funds. And I'm happy to answer any questions you may have about that. But again, this will be coming back at the July meeting for action.
Matthew, as I understand this is not a request for new funding, but simply a transfer of existing funding.
That's exactly correct, sir.
Okay. Any questions for Matthew? All righty. We're out of the Matts and into the Kellys. Kelly, you have item number 10.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, members of the Transportation Advisory Committee. The item before you is simply a review of the draft 2024-2023 Surface Transportation Improvement Program, known as the STIP. As most of you should know by now, NCDOT has released the new draft STIP, the 2024-2033 STIP. which identifies the construction and funding for the construction funding for and scheduling of transportation projects at the state level for over a 10-year period. NCDOT proactively updates said STIP every 2 years to ensure that it accurately reflects the state's current financial situation. The STI law, the Strategic Transportation Investment Law, mandates the ongoing evaluation of the STIP to ensure that the process continues to be responsive to North Carolina's diverse needs. This is accomplished through a process known as the Strategic Prioritization process. We were in the 6th iteration of that process, which began in the fall of 2019, when NCDOT and local planning organizations asked for public feedback on and later submitted projects to be evaluated for the new STIP. In August of 2021, the Board of Transportation concurred with the recommendation to halt P 6.0 due to the rising cost of transportation projects throughout the state. Instead, the prioritization work group, which is made up of Mpos, division staff, and Strategic Prioritization Office of Transportation staff members, worked on refining the current STIP to make it more fiscally constrained. The new STIP, therefore, does not contain any new projects, but rather reprioritizes existing ones based on their current schedule, the cycle that the project was committed in, and the updated cost estimate. I have with us Mr. Pat Ivy, who will do a presentation on the new STIP and the process that birthed it.
Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate that introduction there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the TAC. Byron, go ahead to the next slide. I'm going to give everybody a high-level look at the STIP that was just released back in April. Some of the information that I'm going to cover, you may have already seen, but given the importance of what we're going through right now, I think repetition is probably a good thing. So, going to give you a little bit of background, talk about the development of this TIP and the new format, talk specifically about the prioritization status of projects, and then talk about our next steps, obviously giving everybody an opportunity for any questions at the end. Next slide. So as we begin, let's talk about some initial insights that we want to talk about. What we're talking about today is really a programming or a planning issue. It is not a cash issue with DOT, as we have seen in the past. Currently, our cash balance is over $2 billion, as we've talked about before, and the 4-year federal STIP 2020 to 2023 remains fiscally constrained. I want to make sure everybody understands as well that no impact is anticipated on pre-2024 project lettings. For an example, here in Forsyth County, that would be projects like the last segment of the Eastern Beltway, U2579AA, and the Haynes Mill Road widening project, U2729. Those projects, among others, remain on schedule. We are continuing to coordinate with individual local governments and Mpos, RPOs, and also working with the prioritization work group for 6.0, of which I am a member. As we said before, the initial draft 2024-2033 STIP was released on April 25th, and we anticipate that the draft STIP will be finalized by December of 2022. Next slide. Reminding everyone about some of the budget challenges that we've had to work with. Obviously, the COVID pandemic significantly affected our revenues in North Carolina. There was some over $8 billion in cost increases on projects since July of 2020, since over 1,000 project estimates were updated. Now, many of these increases were due to outdated or low original estimates, but we do have new processes in place that will ensure more accurate estimates moving forward. The new budgets provided some $3.8 billion in additional revenue to the program, which is a very good thing. The majority of that came from the Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, and also some additional increases from the state budget as well. And I do want to remind everybody as well that the Board of Transportation did approve changing their inflation adjustment factor from 1% compounded annually to 3%. That had an impact of about $2.5 billion on the 10-year program. Next slide. I wanted to remind everybody this is a graphical representation of the Strategic Transportation Investments Law that you all know about. This does show the 22 funding categories from statewide mobility, regional impact, and division needs, and also talks about some of the different types of projects that are funded in each of those categories. Next slide. Going into a little bit more detail, we're going to talk about the amount of money that will be available in the 2024-2033 STIP for committed projects. You can see here in all three, you can see all three of the different categories there, with the focus on Division 9 projects circled in red. All totaled across the state, we are $8 billion over programmed. In the regional impact, Region D, which is Divisions 7 and 9, we're nearly $600 million over programmed. But the good news is on the division needs side for Division 9, we're actually $31.5 million under programmed. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later and how that's going to be reflected in the draft TIP. Next slide. So regarding the TIP development, these are some of the overall goals of the prioritization work group. We've talked about some of these before. We want to develop a trustworthy and dependable STIP that's fiscally constrained, and produce the 2024-33 STIP using the current project list included in the current TIP with a transparent process. Have an opportunity to fund new projects in P7 scoring in all 22 STI funding categories. That was very, very important to the work group and to the Board of Transportation. And then very important, we want to make sure that the process that we use is also grounded in state and federal requirements. Next slide. The framework for the development of the 2024-2033 STIP, as we said before, only includes projects funded in the current TIP. Now, projects selected for funding using one of these two approaches for delivery projects, which were programmed first, that includes projects that are currently scheduled for construction in fiscal years 2024, 25, 26, or projects where right-of-way is currently underway, or projects that have a federal grant tied to them. The second approach is the seniority approach, beginning with projects that were scored under prioritization 3.0, then 4.0, then 5.0. Those projects are all funded or programmed second. We'll also talk about the opportunity to swap projects and project schedules following the release of the draft STIP. Swapped projects must be agreed to by NCDOT and the MPO and RPOs, and the cost of those projects swapped in must be within 10% of the cost of the project you want to swap out. We've met with some of the MPO staff. They're looking at the opportunities that might be available for swapping, and we will be getting together to take a look at those opportunities in the near future. Next slide. Now, as we look at the actual STIP document that was released, several things that we can take away from this. First of all, in the first 5 years of the delivery projects, schedules for over 80% of these projects did not change from what is in the current TIP. That is great news. On the evaluation of the P3, P4, and P5 projects, schedules for 34% of those projects did not change either. And the number and length of schedule changes varied based on the STI category. I did want to spend a minute talking about the other projects. Some of the non-committed projects were programmed to meet STI minimum funding requirements. Now, what does that mean? Well, in order to meet the STI law requirement that we program a minimum of 85% of the available funds in each STI category in the first 5 years of the TIP, and a minimum of 90% of the available funding in the entire 10-year program, we had to fund some non-committed projects in several divisions. If you recall from the slide I showed you earlier, there were several divisions in the division needs category, including Division 9, that were under-programmed with just committed projects. Now, in these divisions, we had to fund some non-committed projects to meet the STI law requirement. Remember, in the Division needs category in Division 9, we were just over $30 million over-programmed. Well, the project in Division 9 that was pulled in, that was non-committed, was a rail grade separation project in Davidson County, P5751, that was used. And that was selected because it was the very next project in the list that sort of met that same criteria. Next slide. This is a graphical or a visual example of sort of going through what I just talked about. Go to the next slide. The first thing that we'll look at as we begin is the delivery projects, which are shown in green. They again were projects that were currently funded for construction in fiscal year 24, 25, and 26, or projects that had right-of-way underway or had a federal grant tied to them. Next slide. The next step was to look at prioritization P3, P4, and P5, or that seniority approach. And we started at P3 and went through 4 and 5 and programmed those projects until the money in those specific funding categories ran out. Next slide. This talks about the opportunity to swap projects. In other words, if you had a prioritization or a P5 project that you wanted to swap for a P4 project that actually got funded, you have the opportunity to take a look at that if it was within 10%, again, 10% of the budget of that 4.0 project, and in the close time frame. It didn't have to be exact, but in a similar time frame. Next slide. And this is the result of that. You see the projects in P3, P4, and P5 that everybody agreed, the MPO, RPO, and DOT all agreed that that was an appropriate swap, and we were able to do that. So moving forward, next slide, let's talk about the TIP format. This is a slide of the old DOT. Most of us, of course, were used to reading it, but many people that are not familiar with the process, this was very cumbersome and definitely not very user-friendly. So we changed it to this. Next slide. And if you've seen the report, you see that it is now in an Excel-based format. The benefits of that, of course, is that it is a searchable and sortable document, and it can be printed on 11 by 17 ledger-sized paper. Much, much better than what we have seen in the past. Next slide. And in that document, you'll see information on the current prioritization status, and I want to talk a little bit about what that meant. The Board of Transportation recently agreed to the P6.0 work group recommendation of a 5-year delivery or commitment window. Now that means projects with the first year of right-of-way or construction in fiscal year 28 or earlier are scheduled for delivery. They are committed projects in that first 5 years. Project with first year of right-of-way and construction in 2029 or later are shown as will be reprioritized in 7.0. Next slide. You see this on the sample of the actual STIP worksheet under the current prioritization status. As a reminder, prioritization status is based on the schedule. Those projects were for right-of-way or construction in 2024 to 2028, they are scheduled for delivery. Projects that are funded for preliminary engineering only, in other words, from 2029 to 2033, those projects will have to be reprioritized. We also have some projects that were previously in the TIP that fell out of the 10-year program after 29. Those projects will also be reprioritized. So the next slide, actually talks about some specific projects in Division 9 in each of these categories that I just wanted to bring to your attention. For the delivery projects in 2024 to 2028, most of these projects had no schedule change whatsoever. Those include projects like the widening of US 158 or 2577A in Winston-Salem and Walkertown, the Great Wagon Road project in Louisville, the Big Mill Farm Interchange and Hopkins Road Widening Project in Kernersville, the Louisville-Clemens Road Improvement Project in Clemens, and the Forum Parkway Project in Rural Hall. All of those projects, the schedules are currently, we were allowed to keep them on the same schedule. Actually, the only project that we actually saw delayed was I-5880, which was the Interstate 40 NC 109 interchange project. That was delayed about 5 years, and that's because of the category that project fell into. All of the projects, with the exception of 2577A, were actually the division needs project. I-5880 was a regional project, and we simply ran out of money before we ran out of projects. So this project had to be delayed 5 years until showing construction in 2030. Now, the next category, scheduled for preliminary engineering only. Again, those projects are from 2029 to 2033. These projects will be reprioritized under 7.0. The ones I have listed are projects on the Western Beltway. Project Section EA, Section D, and Section CA were all included in the current STIP program. These projects are still included in the new 10-year program, but will have to be reprioritized in 7.0. We also have projects below 3 sections of the Western Beltway that were included in the current 2020 to 29 STIP that actually fell out of the new draft TIP because, again, these are funded in the regional category, and we simply ran out of funding before we could get down to these projects. They are segments CB, segment B, and segment A. All of those, you will not find these projects listed in the draft 2024-2033 STIP, and they will be reprioritized under 7.0. Continuing to the next slide. Now, the next steps, I think several of you were included in the local officials education webinar yesterday, and we appreciate you attending that. The STIP coordination meetings with the Mpos, we are working with the Mpo staff on the need and possible schedule for that one-on-one meeting. We are also, as I said before, working with the staff on potential project swaps. They are due in Raleigh to the STIP managers by September 30th. And as I said before, the revised draft STIP is due by December 22. After that, we will also have opportunities for public involvement with the final 2024 33 STIP to be adopted by the Board of Transportation in the summer of 2023. Next slide. The next steps for prioritization, the new P7 work group will likely begin work in the fall of this year. Of course, the P7 work that's done by the work group would actually generate the next version of the TIP, which is 2026 to 2035. And we do plan to return to a 2-year prioritization STIP cycle. We anticipate the submittal window for the P7 projects summer of next year, and anticipated P7 quantitative scores and 2026-35 statewide mobility programming in the spring of 2024. Sounds like a long ways off, but it is just around the corner. And then the last slide I have for you all is just a graphical representation of the schedule that I just talked to you about. So you see all the different steps that need to occur. With that, Mr. Chairman, I will open up the floor to any questions, and I will do my best to answer those along with our board member, Mr. Perkins.
Thank you, Pat. Members, questions?
Mike, this is Robert Clark. Can I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
Pat, we worked very hard to get our belt loop funded. And of course, it's in many different sections. But it looks like in the ones that are not funded now are going from roughly 12 o'clock, I think, over to about 9 o'clock, if I had to do it from a clock standpoint. Thoughts on the probability of those being funded at some point?
We actually had a conversation with the Mpos staff and our TIP managers in Raleigh about the Beltway, because obviously we anticipated that was going to be a source of concern, as it is to us as well. One thing that they did tell us, this is simply a financial issue, and the amount of available funding in the regional category. We do anticipate, even though all of the Western Beltway projects will have to go back through reprioritization, we do anticipate they will still score very well as they did before. It's not a matter of the projects are no longer good or as good. It is just the available funding. And with the decision that the Board of Transportation made to make the committed window or the delivery window the first 5 years, that will leave additional funding available in P 7.0 for new projects and projects like the Western Beltway. So we are hopeful that as we look into 7.0, those projects that fell out will be pulled back in the 2026-35 TIP. Andy, anything you want to add to that?
Yes, the key issue, that's why we changed the escalation cost from 1% to 3% in order to give us a little bit more cushion within the first 5 years. So all of us will be very confident that we can meet those budgets in terms of the projects already in the first 5 years. And if we get this essentially some savings, that will allow us to improve the project identification in P7 and these projects for the Western Beltway.
Okay. So Pat, we will finish going up, say from 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock, from I-40 up to 52 then.
Yes, sir. Very good question. Everything on the eastern side is either complete, under construction, or the last project will be awarded in October of this year. So everything on I-74 is good to go.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for your comment.
Members? I urge everybody to take some time and really take a look at the schedule and see how it impacts your communities. I know you're going to have some questions, particularly on the swap opportunities. So I'm sure Kelly is pretty familiar with them and can answer some of the specific ones. But if you get too deep, Pat, I'm sure, is available to walk you through it and maybe explain those in more detail. But I urge you to take a look at them.
One thing I'd like to mention as well that may be a point of good news on the western side, we will be reevaluating all of the cost estimates, particularly on the right-of-way side. Since those estimates were put together, We're in the process of settling many of those, well, all of the MAP Act claims. So the result is we've already acquired the majority of the right-of-way that we will need for the Western Beltway. And we believe that that will result in decreased cost estimates for those Western projects, which will also enhance the possibility that we'll be able to bring all those projects back in under 7.0.
Okay. And Pat, let me just say, I truly understand the difficulty and challenges with budgeting now, given that, asphalt's probably up 20–30%. I haven't bought any, but it's petroleum-based product, and just everything's kind of crazy right now.
Yes, sir. And unfortunately, that is one of the unknowns that we're having to deal with at this point, moving into the next year.
Yeah.
And those also are the things we need to take into consideration when you look at potential swaps between projects. Don't forget the fact that your escalation costs could go a little higher, but we're trying to have at least a fund, and we can be able to help to be able to fund those as we go forward. But every municipality needs to look at that swap opportunity within 10% if you're going to swap it. Make sure it's done so we can get it back into the board in September so we can put the final step together.
This is a lot of information to absorb, but we are here to help you if you have any other questions.
Mr. Chairman, this is Alan. I just wanted to throw out a thank you to Andy Perkins for continuing to fight for us down there in Raleigh as our representative on the board. And Pat, thank you for keeping everything so understandable for us as well.
Thank you, sir.
Mayor Jones, you were reading my mind.
Sorry.
I had sent a note to Mr. Perkins earlier and thanking him. I know he went down there with his boxing gloves on, and I think he scored a couple of knockouts for us. So thank you guys for all you're doing.
I think you threatened to throw a couple of them out of an airplane.
That's exactly right. The mayor keeps promoting me, so I got to watch out what I'm doing down there.
Very good. Members, any other questions? All righty. Thank you, gentlemen.
Mayor Horn, this is Kelly. If I may add to what Pat was saying about a deadline.
Yes, ma'am.
We mentioned this at TCC, and we felt it might be important for elected officials to know as well that we were asking our TCC members, so staff from every jurisdictions, to review the STIP, the new draft STIP, and get back with us by the end of the month to tell us if they were interested in any swaps, so that we can then schedule some coordination meetings between ourselves, Division 9 and the jurisdictions, because we are on a tight schedule if we're going to do swaps and then get the TAC approval to send them to Raleigh in September.
Kelly, since most of our councils have already met for the month of May, is there any way we can get back to you after that first week in June? Because I think that's when most of us will convene again.
Sure. Yes, sir.
Great. Thank you. Members, anything else? Hunter, you have our last informational item.
Hi, thank you, Mayor Horn, and thank you to all the members of the TAC. Good to see you. Today, we'll be diving into a review of a staff presentation on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funding opportunities, as well as their relevance to the Winston-Salem urban area metropolitan planning area. So with that, we'll get into it. I'll be talking with you about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. You'll note that this version is a bit different than the one that you received through your booklets. We did update it today, since the last couple weeks have actually been pretty busy for IIJA development. So we'll address all those as we go. Next slide. All right, the purpose of this presentation is to inform the TCC and the TAC of the basics of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, what it does, inform you of available technical guides and resources for the implementation of the law. We're also going to spend some time talking about the formula-funded programs that are relevant to MPO activities, and then we'll close out with an in-depth discussion of competitively funded programs that are available to our MPOs. Where possible, we're going to tie it back to MTP themes, just so you can see how it might align with some of our plans that exist. All right, next. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is a $1 trillion investment in infrastructure that spans transportation, broadband, water, power, and more. But More than anything, the bipartisan infrastructure law is a transportation law in terms of the majority of money in the law. Majority of it does go to funding transportation programs, and that's mainly what we're going to focus on today. Everything highlighted in orange will be covered in today's presentation, and you'll notice under the climate, energy, and environment section, we have carved out resilience as there is some relevance to transportation there, and we'll discuss that more in depth. One thing I wanted to flag was that the White House has put out a guidebook that I would compare almost to kind of a Spark Notes for the law. It provides the high-level overview for each individual program within the law, and it's several hundred pages long, but it really breaks down complex programs into their simpler parts. Next slide. The infrastructure law is guided by themes called Building a Better America. FHWA did put out a memo when the law was signed into law, and it was the policy on using bipartisan infrastructure law resources to build a better America. At the end of the day, a lot of the core themes that will pop out through the implementation of the processes, as well as the competitive funding application process, it's all going to be guided by safety, equity, climate and resilience, and multimodal systems. So the projects that are going to be the most competitive when we talk about competitive applications are going to be the ones that you can show, demonstrate, are going to reduce numbers of fatalities and injuries, that they consider traditionally disadvantaged communities, that you are building in resilience when you're constructing new things, potentially from flooding or other natural disasters. And then finally, it emphasizes multimodal systems, so looking beyond single vehicle occupancy travel and considering all users of the roadway, including bicyclists, pedestrians, and so on. Next. So again, to kind of reiterate, this is mostly a transportation law in terms of dollar amount, and you can see that in terms of where the money goes by federal agency. DOT does get the lion's share of that. On the right, you'll see a chart that represents the new investments in transportation by category. This means that these are coming from new programs, and that accounts for about $284 billion total. Of that, we can see that a lot of it does go to roads and bridges, followed closely by rail and then transit. But there's also plenty of carve-out money for safety, EVs, and so on. Next. This slide is mostly just to show you a couple of extra helpful resources and extra readings. The top link is probably what I'll mostly highlight here, and that is that the US DOT has flagged the upcoming Notice of Funding Opportunity announcements. I'll refer to those as NOFOs going forward. And they expect a good number to be coming out in 2022. So if you were to bookmark any one of these in terms of scheduling, it'd probably be that one. But the rest of them are tailored to specific branches of government. The Drexel University Finance Lab put together a really good one for municipalities specifically, but all of those are helpful in their own ways. Next. So IIJA really continues formula funding for a lot of the states. So it functions as partly a surface transportation reauthorization. And a lot of the programs that you're already familiar with are funded through IIJA. And that will be the Disadvantaged Business Enterprises, CMAQ, STBG, and the Transportation Alternatives Program. The one thing that I would mention among all those is that the Transportation Alternatives Program did see a bit of a boost in funding overall compared to previous years. So that is certainly a positive coming out of there. Other formula funding that will go to the states includes funding for the National Highway Performance Program, Highway Safety Improvement Program, Highway Freight Programs, Railway Highway Crossing Programs. There's also money that goes to the states from NHTSA. That is the Section 402 or Highway Safety Programs and National Priority Safety Programs. To give you an idea, the MPO is not usually involved in that particular program, but the Governor's Highway Safety Group has actually delegated money to Forsyth County, specifically the Kernersville Police Department and Winston-Salem Police Department for DWI enforcement. So that's what, kind of that Section 402 funding is referring to. So IIJA continues that. Beyond that, there are a couple of new formula funding programs that are that the IIJA provides for. That includes the Bridge Formula Program, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, which will fund the construction and deployment of fast chargers, as well as the PROTECT program, which is the Promoting Resilient Operations for Transformative, Efficient, and Cost-Saving Transportation that focuses mainly on road flood hazards and things like that. Finally, a lot of the transit programs that you're familiar with, including 5307 and 5339, are continued under this. Next.
Hunter, real quickly, where can we find out more about the EV infrastructure charging programs?
I would recommend the USDOT website has a good overview of the National Electric Vehicle Program. As far as the local ones, we are on standby. And I guess I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because I'll talk about the competitive funding opportunities for EVs in a little bit. But
Great.
for now, I would recommend the USDOT site.
Thank you.
The next slide here is mainly just to show that the IIJA will continue funding the planning programs that are essential to Mpos for carrying out required planning tasks related to FHWA and FTA compliance. You can see the names of those programs there. Next slide. All right. This will probably be the most detailed stretch of the presentation. So here we're going to aim to discuss the competitive funding opportunities where Mpos are listed as an eligible recipient. At the same time, we want to emphasize that while Mpos are eligible recipients, so are individual communities. Individual communities are eligible for these opportunities, and while the following slides do not cover every single funding opportunity that there are for communities, when you put all of the resources that we've linked together, it provides a pretty comprehensive look. When it comes down to it, these competitive grant programs will be available for 5 years, and I would phrase it as 5 years and 5 chances to apply. Next. The first program, we'll look at 10 in depth, but the first of 10 is the Advanced Transportation Technologies and Innovative Mobility Deployment. This allocates $900 million over the course of the next 5 years. That money, once it's allocated, is available till it's expended. This modifies an existing program that focuses mainly on ITS development as well as other advanced transportation technologies. Projects that are eligible, we don't know specifically yet other than projects that improve safety, mobility, system efficiency and performance, and infrastructure return on investment are going to be the ones that are competitive under that. If you're interested in reading more about Winston-Salem urban areas plans regarding ITS and micromobility, there are sections carved out in the Metropolitan Transportation Plan that could potentially lend themselves to ideas there. Cost share for this program is your typical 80-20 split. Next. One up. The next program we'll talk about is the Bridge Investment Program. This is a $12.5 billion program available over the course of the next 5 years. The NOFO is anticipated this month, sometime here in May. And eligible projects will improve bridge and culvert condition, specifically their safety, efficiency, and reliability. If you have a bridge on the National Bridge Inventory that is in poor condition or at risk of sliding into poor condition, those are going to be the bridges that are certainly eligible for funding, and you could apply for funding there. The map on the right you'll see is a map of off-system bridges in our urban area that have been classified as poor condition in one of the latest National Bridge Inventory updates. And we have this other series of maps available as needed too. The simplest way to put the most competitive projects here will be the bridges that generate some sort of environmental resilience benefit, the ones that address the ones that are specifically in poor condition, ones that might improve connectivity for disadvantaged communities, and maybe bring in extra bicycle and pedestrian connectivity as well. The cost share is, again, your standard 80-20 split, except for large projects. We're waiting on more specificity on what constitutes a large project, but we will keep you posted. Next. Charging and fueling infrastructure grants. So these are this is the competitive side of electric vehicle funding that I mentioned a bit earlier. And this is really split into two different groups. This is $2.5 billion over the course of the next 5 years. and half of it goes to corridor charging, and that will, fund exclusively the deployment of electric vehicle charging stations as well as alternative fuels along designated corridors. And these designated corridors have been identified by FHWA, Department of Energy, and so on. To give you an idea of where our alternative fuel corridors are, it is, for the moment, it is 40. But we, in the proposed next round of alternative fuel corridors, you can see that both 285 and 74 are included in there. So charging that it will be beefed up along there, along those corridors. Those are going to be the kinds of funding opportunities you could apply for there. Community charging is more specific to the municipality level, and it focuses on installing EV charging facilities in public places such as parks. It does have an emphasis to low to moderate income neighborhoods, but this one has a bit more flexibility than the corridor charging. This one actually allows you to do environmental reviews before constructing EV facilities if needed. FHWA is expected to publish a NOFO in winter 2022, as I mentioned earlier. And again, these will all follow a standard cost share of 80-20. Next. All right, the Railroad Crossing Elimination Grant Program is a $3 billion program over the course of the next 5 years. It focuses on either closing dangerous crossings or improving the protections around existing crossings, such as upgrading a crossing from something that might just have crossbucks to one that now has signals and actually bars that come down to prevent people from crossing when they shouldn't be. The notice of funding opportunity is expected in June 2022. Potential uses for this would be to install upgrades at areas with a history of high fatality, crash, or near miss history, or just places that have high traffic and have minimal to no warning devices. Again, this follows the 80-20 split. Next. Strengthening Mobility and Revolutionizing Transportation program is pretty similar to the first one we discussed about advancing transportation technologies, except this one focuses more on demo projects. And so this will be the same kind of smart city and community technology systems, so advanced signal operations, maybe bus on shoulder kind of experiments, things like that, automation coordination, and so on. The NOFO is anticipated in September 2022. And this one is unique compared to the others in that there's no non-federal cost share required. So you could apply for the whole thing to be funded by the federal money there. Next. This one we'll go through pretty quickly because this one is probably more likely to involve NCDOT, but it is available for localities. This supports freight and highway projects of national regional significance. So they're often going to be on major freight bottleneck areas and major U.S. highways or interstates. Large projects are defined as $100 million. There are also small projects as well. Applications will be closing at the end of the month for this one, but NCDOT does have a recent history of winning awards under infra. And this follows a cost share of 60-40, but for smaller projects that are valued under $100 million, that'll follow an 80-20 split. Next. The mega projects program is pretty similar. It even involves the same application process. That will also be closing in May 31. The program supports large and complex projects that are difficult to fund by other means, and so hence it has a 90-10 split. The fixes here will be focused mostly on the national highway system, but it also could fund intercity passenger rail. Next. Safe Streets and Roads for All is a new program that NCDOT is not eligible to apply for, but localities are. Eligible projects include developing a comprehensive safety action plan like a Vision Zero, also, supporting activities in support of the safety action plan, as well as actually carrying out infrastructure projects. This has about a 40-60 split in that 40% of the money is allocated towards planning grants. The notice of funding opportunity is out right now, so I do encourage y'all to read it if you are interested in it. And the September 15th, 2022 application deadline is coming up. This relates to bicycle and pedestrian and very much complete streets project seems to be one of the things that they're emphasizing if you go to the webinars. Cost share will follow 80-20. Next.
Hunter, we're starting to lose members and we've got one important item at the end of it. So I don't know if you can streamline where you are.
Yes. So the last program is you can read about on your own, but I'd like to close with just the final slide there, if you could, Byron. Next steps in future discussions. As a group, we'll continue to monitor the release of bipartisan infrastructure law funds and share Mpos with you guys as needed. We will also provide updates on new programs as they're established and administered. And as always, you can contact us with questions. I left my email there, and I'd be happy to take any questions or discuss this any other time as needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Hunter. There's a lot of great information there. And also thank you for introducing several new acronyms into our vocabulary that we haven't had before.
Mr. Chairman, could I make one quick comment?
Yes, sir, Mr. Addy.
Just as a reminder to the group, anytime you're looking at projects, particularly highway type projects under these grants or earmarks or anything like that, just as a reminder about the local match, that anytime that it's expected that state funds they want to use state funds as part of the match for these projects. According to the STI law, any of those projects have to go through STI before we can use state funds as a match. So just being very careful with those projects that you're submitting and keeping us in the loop if you've got projects that you're looking to try to submit.
Thank you, Pat. Anything else? Very good. Folks, I'm going to leap forward real quickly. Unless anybody has any particular staff presentations that are listed there that they would like to hear, we'll hold those for after this next segment. But Kelly, you need to kind of round us up on how we're going to move forward with our meetings.
Yes, sir. So at our last meeting, we discussed the option of meeting virtually, and we have been kind of surveying what other MPers are doing, and also as recently as today, discussed with the city attorney what are options that are available for this board. What we've understood from other MPUs at this point is that they are doing a variety of things. Some are meeting in person, some are still virtual. And anything in between. What we discovered, meeting with our city attorney today, was that we have followed city council's lead on when they resume meeting, but the city council is now opening us the opportunity, or it will be soon, for us to decide if we want to stay virtual or not. We thought we had to wait for NCDOT or the federal government to tell us when we should go virtual, if we can go virtual, but it appears that we can make that decision. And for us specifically, since we follow city councils and the city attorney's lead, we can make that recommendation. So the recommendation is that if we do decide to go virtual, we would have to meet in person to vote on that action. At this point, we're still under the executive order, so there is no requirement for us to meet in person until that order expires. But once that expires, if we desire to stay virtual, we need to first meet in person to have that vote. Another option that other MPUs are doing is keeping at least one or two meetings in person. Some of them include meetings such as the elections of officers. So for us, that would be January meeting. And then any meeting where there is a public hearing, they make those in-person meetings to allow opportunities for the public to easily be there. But those are the few things that I wanted to share. The board, it's at the discretion of the board to decide what they would like to do. But again, we would have to bring an action to the board and vote on that in person if we decide to make our meetings virtual.
Very good. Members, if I could just see a show of hands, and maybe if you'll go ahead and turn on if you'll turn on your cameras. I'd just like to get a feel for how many of you wish to continue at least some of our meetings virtually. You just raise your hand if that's your preference. How many of you wish to come back to in-person meetings? Okay, so we have a split. Why don't we do this? let staff and I get together and we'll come up with a kind of schedule of when we would propose to have in-person meetings and when we might have virtual meetings, and we'll have it ready for our July meeting. So I would say, folks, let's plan on doing our July meeting in person. And that way we can make a determination at that point what meetings we wish to have virtually and what meetings we wish to have in person. Does that sound good to everybody? Any thoughts? All righty, then I guess that leads us to answer your question, Kelly, that we will meet in person on July 21st, and that will be at 2000 Lowry Street, Suite 122. Kelly will get all that information out to you, but plan on cleaning up, being able to put on unlike me sitting here in my shorts that I look like I'm dressed up, but I'm really not. You'll have to go full bore and go dress all the way down to the toes in July. But we look forward to seeing everybody there. And if that's acceptable to everyone, any objections? Great, that's how we'll pursue. Thank you, everybody. We kind of ran long today, but we had a lot of meaty stuff that we wanted to work through. With that, members will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
I think Ms. Adams made the motion, and I'm not sure who made the second.
Mr. Marion made a second.
Thank you, Mr. Marion. Any discussion? Kelly, shoot the roll. Do we have to do roll call for this? And this is just an aye. Okay.
Yes.
Very good. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you, folks. We're adjourned.